All right, with last week being a shortened week, we still see the S&P 500 put in a new all-time high and also put in a closing on a weekly basis, the closing high. But if we take a look at the NASDAQ is put in a all-time high as well, but also it pointed a graveyard doji, a greystone doji. So that could kind of give us a little sign that we might see a little bit of a pullback in the coming weeks. And if we look at Apple, we see Apple the previous week where we saw the WWDC that Apple announced their Apple Intelligence. And then, after that little bit of shot up on this, probably due to a buyback also. But we see a little bit of a reversal this week. So we could see a little bit more downside on Apple and start pulling back. And here, looking at NVIDIA on a post-split basis here, because I was looking at a symmetry move here, and you could see that the symmetry move is pretty much move up to 127 extension, and then now pull back to this 100 extension here. So we could also see NVIDIA maybe do a little bit of a temporary pullback, and I wouldn't be surprised that it will come back down to this 115 area and possibly, come down to these gap here or even into this area near the 100 mark. And here, looking at the VIX future, we see that the future market might be pricing in a little bit of an elevated VIX here because we see that it's formed a little bit of a double bottom and breaking out of this pivot high here. So be watching this future. If it come up to this 17 level next week, we could see it might be pumping up to this 20 area, and that would kind of probably coincide with a little bit of a pullback on the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. And looking at the indexes from last week, we see that the Dow Jones Industrial is kind of holding up quite well, and also the New York Stock Exchange, likewise for the transportation, seems to coming up a little bit. Although we see the Nasdaq did come up, but it kind of pulling back at toward the end of the week. Likewise for the S&P 500, while the Russell 2000 is pretty flat here. So for the week, we see that the Dow Jones Transportation was the best performer, followed by the Dow Jones Industrial, and then the New York Stock Exchange Composite. The worst performer is the NASDAQ. But year to date, the NASDAQ and the S&P 500 is still up over 10%, with the S&P 500 14.5% and the NASDAQ 17 and 18% here. Now, the transportation and also the Russell 2000 is still negative for the year to date, while the Dow Jones Industrial is up just a little bit under 4%. And if we take a look at the 11th sector in the S&P 500, we see that the XLK, the technology sector, is still performing relatively well, relative to the S&P 500. This is a relative strength chart here with relative to the S&P 500. And you can see that the healthcare is kind of weak, and so is the discretionary. The financial is also underperform relative to the S&P 500. Even communication, we saw it seems like it is turning downward now. And here's the industrial is also underperform relative to the S&P 500. And here on the stable is also underperform, and the energy, the exploration, and the material, and also utility. So you can see, other than the technology sector and little bit maybe communication, but communication is also starting to roll over. So basically, it's just other than the technology, all the other 10 sector in the S&P 500 is underperformed. If we look at some of the other sector, the industry, we see that the semiconductor is outperformed. You see that being quite strong, and the oil is still relatively flat near the low here. And same, the exploration and the retail. We're also looking at the retailer is also down here at the low, so that is underperformed. And the biotech, likewise with the miners. And here we're looking at the banking sector. We see the bank is also, relatively underperformed, and so is the regional banks. And here the home builder finally turning down, and also the long-term bond, TLT, relative to the S&P 500 is underperformed. So as you can see, only the semiconductor, that's basically the strong sector that's kind of helped pushing the technology sector in the one of the 11 sector of the S&P 500, kind of propel that, at the record high level. And so it's, helping the NASDAQ 100 as well. Here, looking at the VIX here, you see that the sentiment chart here, the VIX is sitting at 13.2 on Friday, and also the put call ratio is somewhere around 0.72. You see that the market participants are still relatively complacent and a little bit of a risk on. In a shortened week, we are looking at a pretty much of a neutral type of internal. You're looking at the up-down volume ratio. It's not too much on the upside, on the downside here. Likewise, for the advanced decline, it was pretty much neutral. And also the new high, new low is pretty much even for the New York Stock Exchange. And you see that the cumulative AD line didn't really budge too much. It's pretty much flat for the week. And here in the NASDAQ, we also see the up-down volume ratio is pretty much neutral, up and down, not too much, to write home about. And likewise, for the advanced decline, it was pretty much neutral as well. Now, we'll continue to see weakness inside of the NASDAQ new high, new low. We continue to see the number of stock making new 52-week low near that 200 level, while the number of stock making new 52-week high is below that 100 area. And in the cumulative AD line, we continue to see a widening between the the negative divergence between the NASDAQ 100 here. So for a shortened week, the market internal is relatively neutral, so it's not much there to kind of give us any clue of what to expect for the coming week. So we just have to kind of lay low and kind of keep an eye open on see where the price action going to take us in the coming week. And looking at the E-mini S&P 500, this volume profile chart here. Now, I just want to note that we do have a Globex all-time high on the E-mini S&P 500. So based on past performance, that seems to indicate there's a very likelihood that the price of the E-mini S&P 500 will surpass that level during a regular trading hour session. And when it does, that means the S&P 500 will also put in a new all-time high. So just kind of carry that forward. Even though we might see a pullback here, because if we look at this low volume zone here and also this low volume zone, so if we see a little bit of pullback in the coming week, we could see the price come down here, test this 5450 and possibly come down into this 5400 area. And here looking at this market profile chart for the ES, you see that there was a lot of unfinished business down here. So if it come down next week to come down and fill this gap and also this gap, then we could expect a lot of these unfinished business going to get resolved here. Here, looking at this ES daily candle chart here, we notice that the market is pricing in the upper range for the coming week between 5605 and 5597. And the lower range is between 5476 and 5455. Now we see that it is pricing in just slightly above this Globex all-time high near 5588. And here's the regular trading session all-time high. So what we're going to see for the coming week, if it pushed through to a new all-time high, we expect to see this Globex all-time high to get tagged and possibly get up to this upper range here. Now, what I'm looking for is probably will be more of a pullback week and come down to fill this gap and get into this zone here, this lower range, and possibly even work down toward this, this low volume gap here at 5400 and fill this gap. So that's basically what I'm looking for if we're going to get a little bit of a pullback for the coming week from the ES. And here looking at the SPY, we see that the market is pricing in the upper range between 552 and 550.70. And the lower range for the expected move for the week is somewhere between 538.30 and 537. So what we're going to be watching for the coming week is, once again, if it pushes through this all-time high, then we'd be looking for this upper range to get tagged. But for any kind of pullback, I'm looking for this thing to come down to this lower range here and fill this gap, basically get into this low volume zone here and possibly come down to this low volume node here near the 551.56. So we will see this 3 consecutive week of winning streak for the S&P 500 come to an end in the coming week. And will we finally see some pullback from the NASDAQ 100 due to this Greystone Doji here? And is this a near-term top for Apple? And also, will we finally see a pullback from NVIDIA here in the coming week? So although the VIX and also the put-call ratio is relatively neutral, and the market participants are still relatively complacent and risk on, but we are seeing a little bit of a narrowing in terms of the market. Right now, we saw that based on the 11th sector, we only see the technology sector outperform the S&P 500. And within the technology sector, we also saw some strength in the semiconductor sector. So other than that, everything else is pretty much underperformed, kind of flat, or kind of moving down. With this recent winning streak, we could see a little bit of a pullback and maybe do a little bit of consolidation here. We know that based on the ES, the Globex all-time high, that need to get tagged. So we know that there's a high probability the S&P 500 still have an all-time high coming. So it's a matter of how deep will this pullback going to be before we're going to see another bounce up to a new all-time high territory. So if you find this video to be informative and useful, be sure to smash the thumbs up. And also, if you're new to this channel, click on the subscribe to help support this channel. And you'd like to see additional content from me, then go check out my newsletter at substack.com. The link is smtraderca.substack.com. Thank you for watching and good luck on your trading.